The year is 1204 and Constantinople is burning. But it's not the smoke of Muslim siege engines rising in the sky. It's the blaze from torches held by men bearing crosses. Inside the convent of Christ Pantocrator, 43 Orthodox nuns kneel in prayer. Their voices tremble as they chant the Kyrie eleison, Lord, have mercy. Outside, the sounds of boots pounding the stone floors, cruel laughter, and the splintering of sacred doors can be heard. These women have spent their lives in service to Christ. They've taken vows of chastity, poverty, and silence. They were prepared to die by the hands of pagans or infidels, but never did they imagine their executioners would be fellow Christians. Sister Euphemia, 73 years old, has been a nun for 56 years, longer than most of the soldiers outside have been alive. Her weathered hands, gnarled from years of work, grip a wooden rosary so tightly her knuckles turn white. For half a century she has prepared for martyrdom, but she never dreamed it would come from those who wear the cross of Christ. The noise grows louder, the crash of wood splintering. A scream from the convent next door abruptly cut off, followed by a chilling silence. Then the door explodes inward. The men who enter are drunk, some laughing as they stumble in. Their tunics are emblazoned with the red cross. Some wear Deus vult, God wills it, stitched in gold across their chests. Sister Euphemia rises, her voice honed by decades of liturgical chant, cutting through the chaos. We are brides of Christ. You wear his symbol in his name. But before she can finish, a fist crashes into her face, knocking her to the floor. Blood pools beneath her silver hair. What happened next wasn't just a military conquest. It wasn't just war. What followed was the greatest betrayal in Christian history, an atrocity so brutal that 800 years later, its repercussions still echo in the schism between the Eastern and Western churches. The question isn't whether you can handle what came next. It's whether you are willing to confront what history books have conveniently erased. If you seek to uncover the truths that the world has tried to bury, the stories that textbooks have sanitized, then every like, every view, every subscription helps us bring more hidden accounts to light. We delve into Vatican archives, Byzantine manuscripts, and eyewitness accounts that scholars ignored for centuries. Now let's return to the story, because what happened next made the sacking of Zara seem like an act of mercy. To understand how Christian soldiers turned on Christian nuns, you must first understand how the Fourth Crusade became one of the most catastrophic events in medieval Christian history. It all began in 1198. Pope Innocent III, young, ambitious, and filled with fervent zeal, called for a new crusade. This was not the suicidal march through enemy territory that had already claimed the lives of thousands. This time the plan was simple and direct. They would sail straight to Egypt, cut off Muslim supply lines, then march north to retake Jerusalem. It was strategic, surgical, and brilliant. Tens of thousands answered the call. French knights, German soldiers, and Italian merchants, eager to make a profit wrapped in the guise of piety. They gathered in Venice in 1202, ready to embark on their glorious mission. But there was a massive problem, one that would prove catastrophic. They couldn't pay for the ships. Enrico Dandolo, the Venetian doge, was 90 years old and supposedly blind, but his mind was sharper than any blade forged in Damascus. He saw an opportunity and took full advantage of it. "You owe us 85,000 silver marks," he said, his voice steady as stone. "I will forgive the debt, all of it. In exchange, you do Venice one small favor. That favor? Attack Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic coast that had rebelled against Venetian control." The Crusader leaders hesitated. Pope Innocent III had explicitly forbidden attacking fellow Christians, with excommunication and eternal damnation as punishment. But they were stranded in Venice, broke, and with 30,000 armed men who had nowhere to go. So they did it. In November 1202, they sacked Zara, Christian soldiers, killing Christian civilians. The Pope excommunicated the entire army. Then came the second deal with the devil. A Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos approached them, young and desperate, offering everything they could dream of. "Help me take back Constantinople from my uncle," he promised. "I'll pay everything you're owed. I'll reunite the Orthodox Church with Rome. I'll fund your entire crusade to Egypt." It sounded too good to be true, because it was. The Crusaders diverted to Constantinople, the wealthiest Christian city on earth, home to unimaginable treasures, ancient libraries, irreplaceable relics, and dozens of monasteries and convents filled with monks and nuns who believed their holy vows would protect them. They arrived in June 1203. Through a combination of diplomacy and force, they installed young Alexios on the throne. He promised the moon but delivered nothing. No money, no church reunion, no supplies. By January 1204, the Byzantines had had enough. They overthrew Alexios, some say strangling him with a bowstring, and installed a new emperor who demanded that the Crusaders leave immediately or face annihilation. Now, the Crusaders were trapped, broke, starving, humiliated, excommunicated, lied to, and played for fools. They were camped outside the wealthiest Christian city in the world, having been used as pawns in a deadly game. The Crusader leaders held a council. The decision isn't recorded in official documents, but the result speaks for itself. On April 9th, 1204, the horrors that followed marked the beginning of one of the greatest betrayals in history. The Crusaders launched their attack. If this moment in history doesn't stir you to learn more, you may be missing the very lesson our ancestors sacrificed their lives to teach us. The most dangerous enemy is not the one who looks different from you. It's the one who looks just like you, but convinces himself that your suffering is justified. April 12th, 1204. Dawn. The Venetian fleet arrives at Constantinople's sea walls, massive ships with siege towers mounted on their decks. It's unprecedented, brilliant, and terrifying. The city's defenders fight with all their might, but they're exhausted, outnumbered, led by an emperor who's been in power for less than 3 months. By midday, the sea walls are breached. Emperor Alexios V flees through a secret gate, taking what's left of the imperial treasury with him. The city is left leaderless and defenseless. Then something breaks. There's no organized occupation, no military discipline. The Crusader commanders lose control. What follows are 3 days that chroniclers would later call the sack of Constantinople. But these 3 words, so clinical and detached, fail to capture the sheer horror. Nikitas Choniates, a Byzantine historian, scholar, and senator, watches from a window as the Crusaders flood the streets. Years later, when he finally finds the words to describe what happened, he writes, "They smashed the holy icons and hurled the sacred relics of martyrs into places I am ashamed to mention. They brought horses and mules into the Church of Holy Wisdom to carry off the sacred vessels, the pulpit, the doors, and the furniture. The Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, a building that had stood for nearly 7 centuries, was turned into a stable. They smashed the silver icon of the Virgin Mary, broke down the walls separating the nave from the altar, and loaded the pieces onto pack animals. A prostitute danced on the patriarch's throne while drunken soldiers cheered. The altar of Holy Wisdom, where emperors were crowned, where the liturgy had been sung without interruption for 700 years, was stripped bare and desecrated. But buildings can be rebuilt, relics can be recovered. What happens to the living is permanent. Constantinople was home to hundreds of monasteries and convents, thousands of monks and nuns who had devoted their entire lives to prayer, poverty, and chastity. They believed their holy vows would protect them. They were wrong. The Crusaders moved through the city like a plague. Nikitas writes, his hand trembling as he forms the letters. They spared neither age, sex, nor religious profession. The medieval code here is delicate language for something unspeakable. It means nuns. Sister Euphemia lies on the chapel floor, blood pooling beneath her head. She's barely conscious now, still alive, but on the edge. The other nuns huddle against the far wall. The youngest among them is Sister Anna, only 17, who took her vows just 6 months ago. The oldest is Sister Maria, 81, who has prayed in this chapel longer than many of the soldiers outside have been alive. The Crusaders don't see brides of Christ. They see captives, spoils of war. A knight steps forward, later identified in Venetian records as Guillaume of Champlit, a nobleman from Burgundy. Dressed in full armour, a red cross on white linen emblazoned across his chest. He's drunk enough to slur his words, but sober enough to know exactly what he's doing. These are heretics, he says in French, schismatics. The Pope himself has said they've broken from the true church. It's a lie. Pope Innocent III never said that, and in fact, he would later express his horror over what transpired here. But Guillaume either doesn't know or doesn't care. Sister Anna steps forward, holding a silver cross passed down from her grandmother, brought from Macedonia. She speaks in broken Latin, her voice trembling. We follow Christ the same as you. We pray to the same God. Please, have mercy. Guillaume rips the cross from her hands, examines it briefly, and then throws it against the wall with such force that the silver dents. Your Christ lost, he sneers. Ours won. What happens next is not a matter of speculation. It's recorded in multiple historical sources, Catholic and Orthodox. Some describe it in clinical terms, while others can hardly bring themselves to speak the words. The devastation of Constantinople, according to a contemporary account compiled from survivor testimonies, describes it this way. The Latins violated the sanctity of holy places. They showed no reverence for virgins consecrated to God, nor for women of venerable age. They took them by force. The text then stops. The scribe could not continue, but we know what happened next because Sister Euphemia survives. A later Orthodox source, the Chronicle of Novgorod, records testimony from refugees who fled to Russia. The story lives on, passed through whispers, and sealed in the memories of those who fled the unimaginable horrors. The Latins violated the nuns in their convents, desecrating the sacred spaces they had vowed to protect. Icons were torn from the walls and used as makeshift tables during their feasts. Dogs were dressed in priestly vestments and paraded through the streets as mockery. When the nuns attempted to resist, once again, the chronicler's pen stops. The scribe either could not or would not write what came next. But we know the truth from multiple Catholic and Orthodox sources. One Catholic chronicler, Geoffrey Dialharder, who was present with the Crusaders, confessed, since the world was created, never had so much booty been taken from any city. Another Catholic source, Pope Peter of Capua, so horrified by the events, wrote to Rome. He wrote that they spared neither age, sex, nor religious profession. Sister Anna was only 17, and Sister Maria was 81. It didn't matter. The Crusaders took them all. Not all died quickly. Venetian records from 1205, a year after the sack, show Greek women of religious vocation being sold as slaves in Christian markets by Christians. Some of these women ended up in harems in Venice. Others were shipped to Crusader states in the Levant, forced to serve in households that mocked their vows daily. A few were ransomed back by Orthodox communities who scraped together gold they didn't have. Most, however, simply vanished from history. Sister Euphemia is one of the few who escaped. She fled Constantinople with a handful of survivors, traveling through Greece and then farther east to Russia. She carried nothing but the clothes on her back and memories that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Years later, as she lay dying in a monastery in Thessalonica at 110 years old, Sister Euphemia recounted her ordeal to an Orthodox priest. Her hands trembled as she spoke, and the priest recorded every word. This testimony was preserved in the Chronicle of Athos, buried in a monastery library for centuries. She described how Sister Maria, the abbess, tried to protect the younger nuns, and how Guillaume of Champlet laughed as he tore a relic from Maria's hands. She recalled what he said, "Your Christ lost, ours won." Sister Euphemia spoke of Sister Maria, 68 years old, scratching Guillaume's face so hard it drew blood. She described him throwing the old woman down the convent steps, the sickening sound of her skull hitting the stone. Sister Maria died 3 days later, never regaining consciousness. Sister Euphemia also described watching the other nuns, 42 women ranging in age from 17 to 81, being dragged from the chapel. She recalled their screams, how some of the Crusaders wore the cross while committing acts that would make demons weep. She wrote, "He wore the symbol of Christ's suffering, and he made us suffer in Christ's name." Years later, when Orthodox Christians finally reclaimed Constantinople, they found something in the ruins of the convent of Christ Pantocrator, scratched into the stone floor, barely visible. Crude marks made with fingernails or shards of broken pottery. 43 small crosses, 43 names written in Greek. Beneath them, in letters so faint they were almost invisible, "Father, forgive them. They knew not what they did," but they did know. Guillaume of Champlet knew exactly what he was doing when he threw a 68-year-old nun down those steps. The soldiers who forcefully dragged Sister Anna, just 17, from the chapel knew exactly what they were doing. The Venetian merchants who sold Greek women of religious orders in slave markets were fully aware of their actions. They justified it to themselves, believing these women, these Orthodox Christians, were heretics, schismatics, beneath humanity. They convinced themselves that the riches of Constantinople were their rightful prize, that God himself had sanctioned this holy war, and that anyone who stood in their way was deserving of whatever suffering came their way. These men wore crosses, prayed before they battled, took communion, and then turned their weapons on the very people they were supposed to protect. If you've stayed with this story so far, It's because you understand why it needs to be told. Subscribe to Crimson Historians, not for us, but for them. For the voices erased from history. For the women whose names were wiped from memory by those who claim to fight in God's name. Now, let's explore the aftermath. When Pope Innocent III in Rome heard about the sack of Constantinople, he was reportedly so shocked that he fell ill. In a letter to the Crusader leadership, he wrote, "How can the Greek Church be brought back into unity with the Apostolic See, when it sees in the Latins only an example of piety and works of darkness, so that it now detests them more than dogs?" The Pope, who had excommunicated the Crusaders twice, realized the gravity of what his crusade had caused. It had obliterated any hope of reconciliation between Christianity's East and West. Before 1204, there had been hope. Hope that the great schism of 1054 could be healed, that the East and West could reconcile, and that Orthodox and Catholic Christians might reunite. But after 1204, that hope was shattered. The Orthodox Church would remember the Fourth Crusade as the ultimate betrayal. The moment when Catholic crusaders, motivated by greed, committed atrocities worse than any inflicted by Muslim armies on Christian civilians. Pope Innocent III condemned the sack in letter after letter, but the damage had already been done. The gold was looted, the relics scattered across Europe, and the women either enslaved or dead. As for the Crusaders, most returned home as celebrated heroes. Guillaume of Champlit, the knight who threw Sister Maria down the stairs, was made Prince of Achaia. He ruled the conquered Byzantine lands for years, living out his days peacefully in his bed, buried with honors in a church he constructed with looted Byzantine gold. The Byzantine Empire, however, never recovered. Constantinople limped on for another 2.5 centuries, but it was a mere shadow of its former glory. The Crusader kingdoms continued to drain the city's wealth, warring among themselves for the spoils. When the Ottomans finally captured the city in 1453, many Orthodox Christians saw it not as a judgment on them, but on the Latins who had first desecrated it. They say it's better to wear the turban of the Turk than the tiara of the Pope. Sister Euphemia lived a long life, passing away in 1241 at the age of 110 in a monastery in Thessalonica. Before she died, she gave one final request to the priest who had recorded her testimony: "Do not let them forget. Do not let them claim it was just a war. Do not let them say it was God's will." The priest, in agreement, nodded and carefully transcribed her words before hiding the testimony deep in the monastery archives. The Catholic Church didn't want this story to be told, and for centuries, it succeeded. Western history books paint the Fourth Crusade as a tragic mistake, a misguided diversion from its original purpose. They discuss the looting of Constantinople and the destruction of priceless art and architecture. They debate whether the Crusaders were justified in their actions, or whether the Byzantines' internal chaos and broken promises led to their own downfall. What they fail to mention, however, are the nuns. They don't tell the story of the 43 crosses scratched into the chapel floor. They don't name Sister Maria thrown down the stairs at 68. They don't speak of Sister Anna, 17, sold into slavery in Venice. They don't acknowledge Sister Euphemia, who lived for 110 years carrying memories that never stopped hurting. The historical record has been scrubbed clean, made palatable for Western audiences who want to believe that, despite their flaws, the Crusades were fought for a righteous cause, that Christian soldiers, however brutal, were acting in defense of their faith. The Orthodox Church, however, remembers the events differently. Across Greece, Russia, and Serbia, they hold a memorial service every April 13th, not for the buildings that were destroyed, nor the treasures that were stolen, but for the women who were violated. For centuries, Sister Euphemia's testimony remained hidden, forgotten in that dusty monastery library. But in 1967, Greek historian Anastasio Karposilos uncovered it while researching Byzantine responses to the Fourth Crusade. While digging through the archives at Mount Athos, Greek historian Anastasio Karposilos stumbled upon an old manuscript. Its pages brittle, the ink faded. As he began reading, he couldn't stop. It was the testimony of Sister Euphemia, now 110 years old, describing in vivid and painful detail the horrors that unfolded in the convent of Christ Panipopis on April 13, 1204. Karposilos published the testimony in 1970, but the academic world barely took notice. Written in Greek, focusing on nuns, it didn't align with the narrative that Western historians had been telling for 800 years. Yet the Orthodox Church knew the truth all along. They had been waiting for the world to listen, and now they were ready to share it. Why does this story matter? Because it's not just about religion or the Crusades. It's about what happens when people believe their cause is so righteous, so divinely ordained, that anyone who stands in their way, even their own brothers and sisters, deserves whatever suffering comes their way. The Crusaders who attacked those nuns truly believed they were doing God's work. They saw Orthodox Christians as heretics who needed to be punished. They thought the wealth of Constantinople was theirs by divine right, payment for their holy mission. They wore crosses, prayed before battle, took communion, and then, with that same divine justification, they destroyed the very people they were meant to protect. Guillaume of Champlitte wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. He was a nobleman, educated, likely pious by his standards. He genuinely believed his actions were justified. To him, Sister Maria, clutching her relic and begging for mercy, was an obstacle standing between him and God's will. That's what makes this story so terrifying. Not that evil men did evil things, but that ordinary men, convinced of their righteousness, committed atrocities and called it holy. History may be written by the victors, but memory is carried by the survivors. The Orthodox Church, the refugees, the testimonies that were hidden for centuries, these people remembered. For 800 years they remembered. In 2004, 8 centuries after the sack of Constantinople, Pope John Paul II visited Orthodox Patriarch Bartholomew in Istanbul, the city that was once Constantinople, and still bears the scars of 1204. The Pope did something unprecedented. It took 8 centuries, but finally, in 2004, Pope John Paul II made a historic apology. He expressed sorrow for the Fourth Crusade, for the sacking of Constantinople, and for the grievous sins committed by Catholics against Orthodox Christians. But it wasn't until centuries later that someone finally acknowledged the atrocities that took place. The nuns of Constantinople, however, never received an apology. Sister Maria never heard anyone recognize her suffering. Sister Anna, just 17 years old and sold into slavery in a Venetian market, never knew that one day the Pope would denounce what happened to her as a grave sin. Their names, their stories are mostly lost to history. Their bodies were never properly buried, and their suffering was erased from the Western narrative for generations. But their crosses remain, scratched into stone, 43 silent witnesses, forever etched into the memories of those who dare to remember. In the 13th century, just decades after the sack, the Orthodox mystic Gregory Palamas wrote, "The Latins entered the house of God with harlots, profaned the altar, and made the church a dwelling for demons. They spared neither age, beauty, nor virtue. This was not the work of Christians. It was the work of men who had forgotten what the cross means. The cross was meant to represent sacrifice, suffering for others, laying down your life for your friends. Christ didn't wear a cross as a symbol of conquest. He died on one as a symbol of love. But in 1204, the Crusaders turned the cross into a weapon. They adorned it on their chests and used it to justify the most heinous acts: rape, murder, enslavement. They looked at women who had devoted their lives to Christ and saw nothing more than property to be seized. They forgot what the cross truly meant. Sister Euphemia, at 110 years old, understood this when a priest asked her if she had forgiven those who destroyed her sisters. Her response resonates across 8 centuries. "I forgive them because Christ commands it, but I will not let them be forgotten." Forgetting is how it happens again. What you've just heard is one of history's darkest truths. A story buried, sanitized, and erased because it was too inconvenient, too ugly, and too damning to the narrative of holy war. If this story reminds you how fragile humanity can be, how easily we justify cruelty when wrapped in the right symbols, then consider subscribing to Crimson Historians, because some voices deserve to be heard, even if they were silenced 800 years ago, and especially then, when the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it.